And, okay. Okay, great. So we had just kind of a free-form discussion about some of the things that were on the forum. In terms of the specific areas that were reflected in the group, so there was quantum information, there was genetics, and there was material science, and I'm probably forgetting something else. So I'll be talking from the perspective of quantum information. So let's see. So in terms of geographic areas, we identified England. We also identified East States. In terms of where slide categories are used. Broad goals for the future would be to create a critical mass of researchers, use this kind of approach, and that would be reflected in things like broad community already. Different. So one thing that was articulated in terms of what we would aim for is that on the one hand, category theory offers unification. You recognize similarities between different subjects. It also offers unification, elegance, proofs, and that kind of thing. However, these things are not so easily quantifiable. That is an issue, and that Delta wants numbers and wants things to do with this that are numerically quantifiable. And so the question is, where does that fit? How do we quality into quantity? Okay, and then just more specific things. These are just notes that I jotted down in terms of components and marketing. There's stuff like journals, book series, and conferences. And the understanding I got from Professor Koch is that we have some of those things launched, not all of them yet, and quantum plus category. Software tools are also exist. And then in terms of long-term goals, one thing that occurred to me is in the topic of algebraic geometry, which is what I did in graduate school, we have the Weil conjectures, which is sort of a holy grail achievement of the field, and it is an obvious thing we point to. It's like, here is a fairly easily understandable problem that required the machinery of algebraic geometry. In the long term, we were able to achieve something like that with category. Okay, and then people also mentioned stuff like societies or geographically local.
Thank you, Carl. Group 2? Yeah.
Yep, that's 2.
Yep.
So we had a rather rambling conversation. So we spent most of our time thinking about the open problem subject, and so we read on something I think is fairly obvious. The big gap is converting abstract ideas to products that engineers can use, or perhaps getting engineers to speak enough of the language of category theories they can design products themselves. And the problem, of course, that small toy examples where you category theory can almost always be more easily solved using some hack that works well enough for that small application. So the big question, I guess, is what point to a large enough scale project or benefit really pay off in an incontrovertible manner, which is branded example that then will catch on. And so as we're working up to that, I guess the arguments that we came up with, I guess, try to speed up this process, one of which is the obvious one. Do you want to be able to handle more general problems? You do this. That technique, generalize it. And then another argument. be well understood by all category theorists, by anyone else, which is that these particular methods of category theory and problem. Another person put it very nice. Category theory tells you what questions to ask. Again, to me that's just blitheringly obvious, but that's kind of been pretty hard to kind of time. And finally, in terms of what category theory-based tools or technologies have been used, I just want to mention two that we have heard about here yet. So one is a company called Statebox, run by Yella. Is Yella around? Yeah, back there. So everyone should talk to him about his company, which is category theory, open Petri nets, the like, on distributed educational system. And another one is a company called Pyrofex, which is run by Nash Foster from Google and Mike Stay, former student of mine, which is Silicon Valley startup that's trying to use a lot of category theory to also to design distributed computation. I think they're occupying pretty different domains in this space, but both these companies are really actively researching that field, hiring people to do it. I guess that's all I have.
Okay, so.
What's the name of the company?
Michael.
Oh, sorry, I have trouble hearing that. Oikos, yeah, so like the Greek word from which economics.
And
Great.
technology.
What?
And technology.
Right, that's right. Well, they were economy.
Right,
I
we
was also
agree.
that Haven Quantum Computing was going to fund our new journal.
Right.
Awesome.
Do you know if that company is doing any category theoretic research?
But they're paying us to
Awesome.
do quantum computation diagrams.
I also wanted to say, so I want to strongly encourage you guys to also write down anything that you don't see get presented that you want to say. Write it down on a sheet or send me an email, and we'll filter all of these individual comments into. I mean, not to say that you shouldn't be talking now, but also send them to me so that we make sure that they make it important.
Okay, so I'm actually not a category theorist. I'm faculty in a systems engineering department, and so I'm hoping what I say is not blitheringly obvious to all of you. But I'm going to try to motivate a lot of what our group talked about in a systems engineering context. So I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to cover 3 main points, but I'm going to try to do that in a sort of by giving concrete examples. We thought one of the sort of the primary take-home values of category theory is interoperability, but not just interoperability that is not fragile. So what do we mean by that? Fragile interoperability is fragile because it's a kind of a one-off thing. And so an example of this is I actually used to work for a couple of years at a company that proposed a solution to hook together a whole bunch of different military platforms. So why would a company do that? Well, obviously there's market opportunity. But once you sell a solution like that, you're not done. You actually have a continuing revenue. Every single time any one of those other companies changes what they do, you can then go back and say, well, we'll update our platform for an extension on the concept. Category theory actually enables you to define these higher level of abstraction that don't necessarily make you subject to that kind of fragility. And specifically, we talked about 2 types of interoperability. One is horizontal interoperability between, for example, specialties. One of which is vertical interoperability across levels of a hierarchy. So we talked a lot about how specialist engineer may have to interact with a systems engineer, may have to interact with architects, all of whom are facing different kinds of constraints. The lowest level may be physical, then you may be dealing with more cognitive, then you may be complexity, for example, and you may be dealing with more social or political constraints. So that actually takes us to the second benefit, which is what we transfer. And this is the idea of what is it that I can get from one view of a system that can maybe inform another view of a system. In the world of systems engineering, we talk a lot about architecture frameworks, views of the system, and the behavioral representation, and physical representation, and somehow we want to have some kind of common model underneath. But the problem is when you build a model that's the size of the world, then it's not actually a model anymore. It becomes a artifact that nobody understands. So this notion of theorem proving and the way that category theory can take advantage of theorem proving maybe has an analogy and the notion of, say, technical feasibility. All right. So, for example, in systems engineering, we spend a lot of time looking at trade spaces, and we have what's called the feasible region. They're the things that you can actually build, and the infeasible region. They're things that, for whatever reason, you can't build, either because if you try to build it, it'll explode, or it's expensive, or whatever. For some reason, you can't build it. So, if in the same way that you could say, well, this is a theorem that generates a result, either it's true or false. This is a system that is either feasible or infeasible. The question is, can we abstract away from the specific technical or physical or whatever representation of the system up to something that can communicate to a higher level decision? If you try to do this, it's actually not going to work. So if you'll give me, I want to read a short anecdote about it. Let me know if I'm talking. So U.S. standard railroad gauge is actually a great example of this. It is 4 feet 8.5 inches. Why do we use that gauge? Because that's the way they built railroads in England, and English engineers use railroads. Why did the English build them that way? Because the first railroad lines were built by the same people who built the wagon tramway, which is they used. Okay, why did they use the gauge for the wagon tramways? Because the people who built the tramways used big tools that they used for building wagons. Had that wheel spacing. Okay, why did they have that wheel spacing? Because if they tried to use other spacing, the wagon wheels would break, because a lot of the older roads in England had wheel ruts from lots of usage of previous wagons. Wheels don't fit into wheel ruts, they bounce around a lot, eventually they fall off. Not great. So why do you have these old rutted roads? Well, that actually came all the way back to imperial Rome. Okay, so under the Roman Empire, the first long-distance roads were designed for their region, and those roads were rutted according to which of the standard Roman war chariots. Why does the standard Roman design capacity of 4 feet inches? That's their estimate of the width of the average horses behind. Two average horses behind two, but one next to each other. So use different. Try that. But at any rate, here's a sort of an interesting twist on the story. Now think about the space shuttle, right? The space shuttle is designed in part as a technical, part as a political system. Delivers jobs, creates constituencies. If you have any doubt about that, you can go look at congressional testimony. So we have a system that is designed to be distributed across the country for political and social reasons. Which means that when we design our solid rocket boosters, which are made in Thiokol, they're not actually assembled in Utah, they're assembled in Louisiana at the production. So the engineers who designed the solid rocket boosters would have, for technical reasons, preferred to design them to be a little bit wider, a little bit shorter. But they had to be able to get those solid rocket boosters from Utah to Louisiana. It means they had to go by railroad. It means that they had to fit inside that railroad. Okay? So, they had to actually physically fit through the tunnel. So one of the space shuttle's major design features is by the Imperial Roman. So why is that important? Why am I telling you? Because this is an example of what we call legacy requirements. Things that have been imposed on the system by virtue of the fact that designing an entirely new system from scratch does good. The requirements get carried forward. This is a physical constraint online posed by cost and social and sort of background first. So the question is, can we use categories to communicate sorts of feasibility constraints up the chain or down the chain? The last thing, very briefly, is that category theory gives us a basic modeling world. So we don't necessarily know the world. We don't necessarily know what the world looks like to somebody from specialty. The question is, can we identify and formally express under deep uncertainty what we can still say? And can we, by defining what it is that we can say, maybe what we can say, can we, in that way, build flexibility? So David mentioned that the category theory gives us the ability to gracefully relax. And so in so doing, we may actually be able to obtain that flexibility by identifying what aspects of the structure do we really have to maintain, which aspects can be allowed to change as things that we think we cannot end. I think I'm probably.
Yeah, we gotta move on to the next one. Thank you, David.
Make a comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry again. So it's an example of like legacy requirements, and that's great choice. But I think it's also an example of getting things done and not like finding all the expressions. Not saying it's the right way, but there was this idea. I think Bruce will talk about it, like in some sort of change data structure, string diagrams, or something for tooling. But at the same time, it's also very important that they didn't decide to replace all the railroads before building the
100% agree.
Two perspectives, maybe the engineering has. I would say that's probably.
So I want to thank Sub and Allison for imposing some ex post facto data hygiene on certainly my rambling notes. I'm going to go down more or less through the list. So in terms of people involved in applied CT, one person who wasn't on my radar until quite recently, and I mention this because I haven't seen her on other people's radar, is someone by the name of Olga Armangieva at Concordia in Canada, who's working on multi-agent modeling category theory. Like a lot of folks in Carolina work with it. Of course, everyone knows about topological data analysis, also a lot of this stuff. And I think we could argue that Microsoft is also, insofar as topological quantum field theory helps them build this anionic gizmo, that they are also funding a lot of work in that. So geography, I'll just restate the obvious. Obviously, there's a center of excellence at Riverside and at Boston. I think it's fair to say, and you folks can correct me if you think this is inappropriate characterization, that Riverside is focused on networks and Boston is sort of focused on operads and data, that sort of thing. And to the extent that there's a burgeoning community in the DC area, I think it's also fair to say that it's naturally going to gravitate towards systems and systems work. Because NIST is going to pull in that direction. Folks like PAE are going to pull in that direction, and Metron are going to pull. Everyone that has skin in the game is going to pull it in that direction. So that feeds into applications. So right now, what it's used for is specifications and justification. So what are the data structures? Why did you pick this one? How do you fully specify something? Data integration. So that's certainly a form of fusion, but I'll get back to that later. And again, systems and systems. So really just right now it's obviously at a preliminary stage, but there's some use cases. David gave a good example of that, and there are others. More sort of operatic formalisms or that. So in terms of going forward, open problems, so things like motion models, probabilistic reasoning is a big thing, especially for folks that have sorts of interests in the DC area. And I know that probability is a notoriously difficult thing to do in category theory, so as far as you can A, do it, and B, improve in some way on the state of the art, right? Build a better tracker, build a better fusion, gizmo, that would be enormous. And of course, long-term systems-to-systems applications that are real, that again improve on the state of the art, rather than reinventing the wheel, or doing something in a very elegant way that is really quite small. In terms of resources, we didn't really address that. It wasn't clear to us. Tools and technologies, I think a lot of folks know about AQL, and some had mentioned that there's a tool used by Airbus called Mega, and one of us, I don't recall who, mentioned CatLab. I don't even know what that does, but we've heard about somewhere. In terms of the future landscape, so for marketing, for 2 years, we felt that really doing realistic proofs of concept, not just proofs of concept, but realistic ones that can speak to engineers in terms of specifications or bottom-up ontologies is very useful. Moving forward in time, doing some probabilistic reasoning over 5 years, having some sort of real specification examples where it's really equivalent to the current state of the art would be helpful, and doing sort of universal modeling with category theories of ideas to have, I think eventually there's fairly broad consensus that we want the successor to SysML and UML to be built on categories. Right? Whether that's 5 years or 10 years down the road, seems self-evident that that's where at least we want things to head, or at least our group. In terms of components, in the near term, a lot of work on data integration and process models for taxonomy. The sort of metaphor that came to mind was if you are, in terms of using a taxonomy to, rather than have some complicated theory where an engineer has to learn about symmetric monoidal categories from scratch, probably in the spirit of the Rosetta Stone paper, have example that says, if you want this sort of behavior, this is the gizmo you want, then you can go learn more about it. If you want this other sort of phenomenology, this is the gizmo you want, then you can go learn more about it. So something that's oriented in terms of behaviors, and then gives pointers into the sort of complicated details. In terms of who we want to build tools for, or who we want to build tools and target, in the near term, we think it's systems and software engineers. Maybe in 5 years, it'll be folks like chemical or electrical engineers, or a lot of the work on sort of networks, and reaction systems, and things like that can be translated fairly productively. And then in the longer term, it'll be things like mechanical or complex systems engineers, once we have some basic tools that have matured and that have demonstrated some utility. So that's all we have. I recommend this to you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm up for group 5. Okay, so we pretty much circled around mostly some computational and some data issues with maybe some other, a handful of other things thrown in. So let's see, here's my summary. Okay, so first, I guess, a couple of points that are not quite so direct. So one, Duško wanted to emphasize what he sees as the importance of this venue and more generally the government in sort of putting a foot into the ring and saying that this is something that we see as a real future technology or future direction for technologies, in the sense that gives a sort of imprimatur that can help in marketing and other contexts. Let's see, we need to be careful to avoid dogmatism. So this was a big thing that I think cut against the categorical community in the 70s and 80s, and myself and maybe some others have tendencies in this direction, and we need to be careful to sort of temper those. Also, we are doing not great in terms of inclusion, and sort of right here at the beginning of the field, while we're still small, I think we really need to make more of an effort in order to have a more diverse community. Okay, so in terms of computing and data and other things. One thing that I think is particularly important for us to set up in the near term is some sort of more coherent portal. So we had a meeting at NIST about 2 years ago, and we put a website up, but sort of the people who were managing it, including myself, don't really have either the know-how or the right strategy for maintaining a good stream of content and so on. And so I think we need to find some people, and I don't know quite how to do that, but maybe this is something that we want to at least set this up, and maybe also to manage having a place where you can go if you don't know what CT is about, where you can go and you can find out the applications in your area, you can find out the people who are interested in those type of applications, and just to sort of share what we're doing more broadly. Let's see, what else we got? So in terms of software, we're never going to get to the tools that we really want, because they're really hard, and as we have more, we will want more. And so in some sense, someone pointed out that really what we need to do is get the ball rolling. And certainly there are pieces of that. The AQL software is great. Oxford has the Quantumatic and also the Globular software. But somehow there's not a lot of coherence in what we're doing here. And in terms of practical steps for addressing that, I think Evan suggested that having some common data formats that we can agree on help. At the same time, we had some other people in the group who suggested that this is already a very hard problem. But again, we might as well start with some things that are imperfect and learn where we've gone wrong, and then try and improve on them, rather than sort of waiting until we have the perfect thing. Let's see. In terms of other things that we sort of need in terms of tools, so UI is a big obstacle, and I think also user interaction. So user interface and user interaction. So when we express things in terms of categories, that gives us a language for expressing the things, I think, very often that people want, the intuitive things that people want to do. But there's a lot of work in translating from that intuitive idea into its expression in terms of category theory. And very often this I think, can be regularized. If I know that I want to open up a box in a string diagram and look inside to find a new string diagram inside, that's something formally, right, there's a couple of pre-monoidal categories floating around and functors between them. We don't want users to have to think about that. We want to sort of design the interactions so that they will fill in the categorical structure for people. Let's see, another piece that we need, I think, is translators. So back and forth from existing formats. So this really goes back to the legacy issue. I think a big part of what category theory can do is support the sort of backward interoperability, because it's so good at taking things from different places and reframing it in a common language. That gives us an opportunity to sort of take all of the work that's already been done in OWL and database and at least port some of it over to the language that we're using. Another thing, I guess this is tied to something someone already said, was a list, or maybe online, or maybe just sort of in our heads even, of the big open problems or conjectures in the field, so that people have some targets to really go for. As Ryan said, we need to pull in more people from the programming, the computer science community. This is going to be really big for implementing the tools, because they know what they're doing, and at least I do not, and many other math don't really know what we're doing in terms of building a real production software system. And let's see, one other thing that we had was the possibility of industry alliances. So some sorts of support systems where industry can come in and contribute relatively small amounts. So not enough to build a system, but together put in some money to build a common system that everyone can use. And I know that there's a lot of issues in terms of intellectual property that go into that. And I think that's actually going to be a significant set of issues that we as a community front. So I think that's all for me. I don't know how faithful I was to the rest of my group, but
Can I comment on that?
sure.
We don't just need computers programming, we need them because they have a very established unity
in using category theory as really at the top level of research.
Yeah.
In Europe, maybe not in the US, people were forgetting about Europe a bit early. In Europe, you can be top computer science world and just be playing category. I mean, I'm an example. So you need these people on board because they are totally established as a community, doing category theory as daily practice, as totally accepted.
Yeah.
But there is this funny thing, I don't know if people know the conference how I go track A and track B. Track A are the Americans, track B are the Europeans. Track B is category theory and stuff.
Okay, group six.
Theoretical computer science journal is A is algorithm, like one of them is algorithm complexity, the other is like semantics and logic, and people usually refer to them as American theory, European and Euro theory.
Exactly.
Cool. So yeah, for anyone I haven't gotten a chance to say hello to yet, I'm Blake Pollard. I'm a postdoc here. But yeah, so our group, we had a pretty open-ended discussion, and just to give you an idea of who was there, we had people who were kind of from an econ open games background, and then people who were thinking about systems engineering, as well as connectivity spaces, and also people from mechanical engineering. I think we've all had, we're getting to see that we've got a pretty diverse set of fields. And as far as discussing regions for future events, I mean, besides DC as a potential future event, and the East Coast in general, I guess the Netherlands is not represented here, but has a pretty high per capita density of category theory. Yeah, so as far as where we are today, I think that a lot of people feel that there's like tools and prototypes that exist, but again, there's this kind of lack of coherence with what they are, what they're capable of, what's the barrier to entry for them, and then also I think that ties into the fact that some of them maybe haven't spent as much time on the GUI side, the user interface side. Clear area where we could improve. So we also had a decent representation from the kind of startup crew, who I think accesses a different kind of funding model than maybe some of the more traditional academics or industry folk here. So the message we kind of got from them is that we really kind of already have a story to tell for almost like a disruptive technology in this. So if you really have funders who aren't as risk averse as some agencies, they're really open to these ideas, but what we lack, and I think this has been touched on early, is really the implementation, right? And the kind of use case that gets deep enough in this kind of complexity, difficulty curve that we saw yesterday to kind of demonstrate the ability of the category. Complex. Yeah. These guys have confidence that they can already sell it, but they could always use more ammo. Yeah, and also maybe identifying like risk-averse funders or less risk-averse funders who are more willing to work with people in academia. Yeah, so also kind of coming from the startup crew, the dreamers, I guess, is that I think, and it's a good point, is that there's a lot of hierarchical organizations that exist today that are kind of trying to, get themselves out of this structure in some sense. Maybe they already have it in terms of their people, but also their technologies, right? And maybe they want to maintain the people hierarchical structure while maybe not flattening, but getting a different structure for how they use it. Military is maybe one example with Cascade. Blockchain for the financial institution is maybe like another example. So you kind of think of, yes, what are the types of organizations out there that teach these tools or approaches might be good for enabling them to realize this vision of drugging off some inefficiency that they've burdened themselves with from this structure. Yeah, and so I think today people already recognize that CT is basically good for principled approaches. So if you have some problems that people feel have been solved ad hoc in the past, then you can come with something that's based on the CT and has a solid mathematical foundation. That's kind of a sell point that already is. But what we haven't, I think, demonstrated as well is kind of, and we touched on it a few times, is that like end-to-end kind of business process management, right? And so in this case, you think of a company that hires someone to kind of do some analysis of a very complicated process that involves lots of tools. They would, back in the day, hire a mathematician and end up with some really messy set of equations, and then once they try to use it for a long time, it breaks at some point, and they don't really have traceability of why that happened. Maybe the future vision is that you hire an applied category theorist and they do it right, or else we maybe provide some of the tools that enable that. But again, I think we kind of lack a really compelling demonstration.
And you also hear the same story, that a lot of organizations attempt this internally over and over again with varying degrees of success, but never really feeling like they necessarily accomplished this goal of kind of tool homogenization operation. Yeah, so on the, yeah, so another thing that doesn't quite exist yet, but would maybe be a better thing to think about is almost a sales program for category theory-based approaches, in the sense that I think just math people maybe have a more difficult time kind of laying out the timeline and also the value associated to each of those milestones. And so this is somewhere where I think maybe interfacing more with computer scientists could really help, because they understand better the, the difficulties to implementation, but also like what the value added is. The ability to say, look, at t equals 0, I could do this, t equals 10, I could. This kind of sales program that makes it easier, value added of an approach. Yeah, so I think we heard a little bit about this as far as what we feel we lack and would like to see in the future, and that's kind of a physical, but also mostly an online kind of collaboration, like platform or space, and maybe the blog or journal that we heard about starting compositionality could somehow, enable this. But the kind of quote we heard in our group was just, "I'd like more interest in what I do," but also like I'd like to know who is working on the same stuff. So I think for established disciplines, journals and conferences really provide this. Like, where to go every year to see what's new, and you have to go every year to keep up. But in our current state, we don't look at it. It's still fun to discover someone, hey, we're going to way to enable that either via the blog. So in that blog journal aspect, I don't know if you guys have ever heard this Distill that exists now. It's a new like machine learning blog/journal that's out there, but it's really meant to encourage exposition, right? And so less maybe cutting edge results, but really trying to reward clear, concise, and also potentially interactive demo and exhibition. So one of the ways that they incentivize this is that not only do they have a journal where you're allowed to publish really good expositions of novel research, but they also have like little Distill prizes, like for the best student, derived exposition of a particular compositionality. And yeah, we've heard a lot about tool development. So I think kind of dream of a 2 or 3 dimensional string diagram integrated development environment that both enables you to like hide away the category theory from users, but also enables the well-trained person to go in and kind of edit both the syntax and the semantics and in a way that enables them to answer your stuff. So yeah, this kind of CT enables SysML, I guess, community. But then for the folks who are more like Sandbox, they kind of see it as a more complex systems programming environment that's also potentially agnostic to implementation language of the processes that you're representing. So there, there's lots of work to be done there. And there, I think a necessary feature there is like the existence of conceptual layers in such a tool to combat complexity, right? Nobody cares about a GUI anymore when you have 10,000 nodes. And so again, that ties in with interacting with scientists. So the only, I think another thing I noticed is just that we get a lot of these stories and anecdotes about working in this kind of young field, and I think that maybe the blog or somewhere would be a good place to kind of share those in like a more systematic way and reward this. Also, it's like a lower barrier to entry to writing a blog post. You just like share about an experience you had, necessarily writing a technical report. And something people want, which I think we also already touched on, was just a standard data structure or a way of specifying categorical objects. So if I want to write one down and communicate them to you, how do I do that? And all kind of share and talk to each other. So I think that more or less touches on some subset of what all we talked about.
All right, thank you, sir.
Yeah.